the other day, going over the highlights, and it wasn't a walkthrough, it was an introduction going over the highlights. So now we've got Mike here who will give us a little more detail.
Yep. Should I begin?
Yes, please.
This is Mike O'Grady with Legislative Counsel. This is the Senate Miscellaneous Ag Subjects Bill. The first section is an amendment to the agency's livestock quarantine authority. As you probably know, they have the ability to order any domestic animal that'll be quarantined because of disease or contagious disease or potential infection. They want to add to that authority the ability to quarantine an animal that's suspected of having been exposed to biological or chemical agents that may cause the animal's milk, product, etc., to be adulterated or otherwise unsafe for human consumption. So if it has too much antibiotic in it or too much of some other chemical in it that they've identified, and they don't want that milk or that dairy product produced from that milk to be sold, they can quarantine that animal until it clears testing.
Questions, Representative O'Brien?
What's domestic? Like, we all think livestock, but it never reaches outside of that, right?
In this definition of domestic animal, domestic livestock, it's basically what you would think of as livestock. It's cows, cattle, swine, sheep, goats, water buffalo, ratites, camelids. So that's what a domestic animal is under this section.
But not household pets, for example.
Not household pets, no. There's a definition in Title 10 and another one in Title 20, which causes some confusion. In Title 10, I think it's called domestic pet. And so people think that domestic animal is the same as a domestic pet, but it's not.
And then, like sheepdogs, guard dogs, where do they fall in all this?
So there's actually a section in law about sheepdogs and farm dogs. I don't remember it off the top of my head, but basically you get to allow them to roam free. And so there's a definition of, I think it's called working dog. I can find that for you. So the next section, section 2, 3, and 4, amend the egg law. So the state has standards for the sale and production of eggs. These standards really haven't been amended since the early 1970s. And so what the agency is proposing is to offer some amendments that modernize, correct, and kind of make some of the provisions in the egg law uniform. The first section, section 2, it's on the prohibitions under the egg law. You'll see the existing law prevents you from selling, offering for sale, or advertising your eggs as fresh or newly laid or native or et cetera. But what's being added is you can't advertise or label eggs in a false or misleading way. You can't sell, offer for sale, deliver, or donate eggs that do not satisfy the requirements of the chapter, largely that they are meeting the production standards. And you can't sell, offer for sale, deliver, or donate eggs that are adulterated within the meaning of Title 18, which is basically they're unfit for human consumption.
We had a question on adulterated for Brian.
So the definition of adulterated is the one from Title 18. I thought I had printed that out. I must have left it in my office. But it basically is, it is unfit for human consumption as determined by, unfit for human or animal consumption as determined by the Department of Health. The adulteration standard is basically the same for humans as for animals. It's unfit as food.
Representative Rice?
Who does this apply to, generally speaking? Like, is it just retailers and wholesalers? Is it?
It's really the production and sale. So if you're giving away eggs from your backyard, it doesn't apply to you. But if it's you're selling these in commerce or advertising them for sale in commerce, it applies to you.
So selling, if you're selling prepared eggs, does it apply, or is it only?
Meaning like a breakfast, or
Yeah.
it does not apply.
Just back to adulterated, in the first section, it read adulterated or otherwise unsafe. So, and I think you just explained that the definition for adulterated means unsafe.
Right.
It's unsafe for human consumption.
Mhm.
So we might think in common usage of adulterated as meaning changed or modified, not necessarily to the point of being unsafe, but in this context, we should think of it as meaning it's something you shouldn't eat.
I should probably read to you the definition of adulterated under Title 18. So it's largely based on the US FDA's definition of adulterated. So if it bears or contains any poisonous or deleterious substance which may render it injurious to health, but in case the substance is not an added substance, the food shall not be considered adulterated under this clause if the quantity of the substance in the food does not orderly render it injurious to health. Then if it has an added poison or added deleterious substance, we insist in whole or in part of a disease contaminated, filthy, putrid, or decomposed substance. If it has been produced, prepared, packed, or held under unsanitary conditions where it's contaminated with filth. If it is the product of a diseased animal or an animal which has died otherwise than by slaughter. And if its container is composed in whole or in part of any poisonous or deleterious substance.
Okay, pretty explicit.
So, moving on in the egg law, there was page 3, line 1. There's an obsolete reference to a division of the agency that no longer exists. The Division of Business Development is no longer a thing. So it's just being struck. Section 4 is bringing the basically the model for agency enforcement, which the General Assembly has asked the agency to implement, to the egg law. And this model originated under the water quality statutes, where the legislature wanted the farmer to receive notice of the alleged violation, what was actually being alleged to be violated, and instruction on what the corrective action would be. So basically a fair warning letter to allow the farmer to come into compliance in an appropriate time. It is a discretionary letter. The agency can act immediately if they want to, but you'll see that this is just when the secretary determines that a person is violating the chapter of the egg law or its rules, the secretary may issue a written warning that shall be served in person or certified mail. A warning issued shall include a description of the violation, identification of this section of the egg law, identification of the applicable violation, and the required corrective action. You'll see that language in multiple different Agency of Ag programs, as it's become kind of the model that the legislature directed the agency to follow for enforcement.
There's a reference in the deleted language to the state's attorney. Is that carried through, or that's gone?
No, you don't need that anymore, for a couple of reasons. First, because the agency now has a general counsel and it didn't have a general counsel for this language. And second, because the attorney general is the one that would enforce major actions for the agency, and they have what are called they're basically service agreements between the Attorney General and agencies to provide a certain amount of time necessary for the agency from the Attorney General's office. And they pay for that. So it's really just the state's attorney. I don't really know why the notice was given to the state's attorney of the county in which the egg was located. I can pretty much assure you that no state's attorney very few were going to bring a case on that.
Representative O'Brien.
Like where, does the FDA have similar language or does Vermont sort of work as their agent?
There's a federal egg law as well. And you may have heard about that recently if you've been following ag journals, because California has imposed humane condition requirements on their poultry farms. And basically the question is whether or not those conditions have extraterritorial effect. And basically it says you can't sell eggs in California unless you raise them in the way that California said. So, that obviously a state can do that for eggs grown within it or produced within a state, but there's questions about whether or not you can do that outside and what its applicability is. The French Egg Society has sued California along with others as to the legality of that requirement underneath the federal egg law. But states can have their own egg requirements as long as they're consistent with the federal requirements, which this bill is. These requirements are. Should I move on?
Yes.
Section 5 relates to the penalties for violation of the egg law. As I said earlier, the law hasn't been amended really since the early 70s, and you see that reflected in the penalties. Of first offense is between $25 and $100, and a second is between $50 and $500. So what this section is doing is again trying to make the Egg Law Enforcement Authority consistent with other enforcement authority that the agency has. And it lists the different types of enforcement actions that the agency can take, including cease and desist orders, stop sale orders, mandatory corrective actions, actions under its default enforcement authority in Title 6, Chapter 1, and any other administrative or civil penalties, again, in their default enforcement authority in Title 6, Chapter 1, Sections 15, 16, or 17. And then it gives some specific directive on when certain orders are issued, when the agency issues an order to cease and desist, stop sale, or take other action or require corrective action. They give that person subject to the order notice, and then they have 15 days to request a hearing. If it's going to be a verbal order, which the agency does have authority to do, especially if they think the product is adulterated and should be pulled from sale or offer for sale, they have to issue that person a written order within 5 business days, and that has to include the 15-day opportunity for a hearing. If you fail to request your hearing within 15 days, it is waived. But if you request one, the secretary promptly sets a date for a hearing. And then last, if a person is aggrieved by the secretary's decision at the hearing or prior or without a hearing, that person may appeal to the civil division of the Superior Court. Moving out of the egg law, you're into just the agency's general enforcement authority. One of the things that the agency has been criticized for, especially with regard to the water quality requirements, is that the penalties for water quality violations are not similar to ANR's penalties. So in an effort to make the penalty amounts a little bit more consistent, the agency is proposing to increase their administrative penalty cap for an individual violation from 1,000 to 5,000. And then for continuing violations on page 6, line 16, increase from 25,000 to 50,000. Those numbers are still both much lower than what A&R's maximum enforcement penalties are, but A&R's maximum enforcement are that way because they're required to be that way by federal law. Because A&R is a delegated entity implementing federal law for a couple of different programs. So they have to have the mandatory maximum penalties under that law. So if somebody says, oh, this should be more consistent with A&R's penalties, which has, for example, a continuing violation cap of like $142,000, you just say, well, that's only really necessary because they're a delegated federal agency, and you can set these penalty amounts at what amount you think is appropriate. Moving on to section 7, this is the capital equipment assistance program. It's a water quality funding program that provides money to farmers to purchase or use innovative equipment. For years, it was really focused on just reduction of surface runoff from agricultural waste, but in the last couple of years, its authority has been broadened to allow for use of equipment to separate phosphorus from manure, decrease greenhouse gases, and reduce costs to farmers. The agency has asked for a change on line 9. They think decrease greenhouse gases is not really the appropriate phrase. It should be mitigate greenhouse gases. And so that's what the change would be. Sections 8 and 9 are probably the most controversial versions of.
Jump to that then, Mike. Just any questions on the greenhouse gas? So we're changing decrease to mitigate, but also changing emissions to gases. What's the, can you just speak a little bit to the legal interpretation of one versus the other?
I think what the agency has argued is that it might be in what they're funding, the equipment might not actually decrease a greenhouse gas emission, but what is intended is for mitigation of greenhouse gases. So for example, you could put a fan in a barn, and it's not necessarily going to decrease the greenhouse gas emissions from your animals, but it could mitigate or distribute those emissions in a way that will help for that farm.
Okay, and it is gases specifically, so.
Yes.
Oh, gases, yeah, okay.
I have
So,
one more question. How did our Agency of Agriculture get away with doing their water rules if those water rules run afoul of the EPA?
So story time. In 2004, the EPA had just introduced a draft rule called the CAFO rule, the Clean Water Act, permitting for concentrated animal feeding operation. And in that rule, it says any discharges from a production area from a CAFO had to get a NPDES permit, a direct discharge permit, either from EPA or from the delegated state. But when you see draft rules and even final rules, they're usually preceded by pages and pages of preamble, which try to explain what the agency is doing and provide guidance for those that will be subject to regulation. In the preamble to the 2004 CAFO rule, there's 2 sentences that say that state agencies are encouraged to adopt their own programs to limit discharges from farms so that EPA, NIPD's jurisdiction is not triggered. And so Phil Benedict, who I don't think any of you know, and Mike Dwayne, who some of you may know. Phil was the head of what is now called the water quality program, but he was also in charge of pesticides. And Mike Dwayne was the general counsel / AG for the agency. They went to Peter Welch's office and said, this is what we want. We're going to create our own Agency of Agriculture water quality program that prohibits any discharges from a farm so that farms don't have to get this EPA NIPD's permit. And that's what they did. And it doesn't violate EPA's requirements. In fact, it's based on a recommendation from EPA. I still have that rule if you want to see the language.
Representative Wilson.
I had a question. Is the agency actually considering greenhouse gases? They're blaming cows? Is that actually what they're doing?
I don't think the agency blames the cow. I think there have been studies that show that they do contribute methane gases, which are a greenhouse gas. And so there have been efforts, most notably at the federal level, to try to implement provisions on farms. I used the fan requirement because out in California, they were putting in huge fans in barns, concentrated animal feeding operation barns, to try and get some mitigation from the methane that was coming from cows. It didn't work that well.
You're talking about really large farms.
Like large, yeah.
Thank you.
So I'm going to put a PowerPoint on the screen for this next two sections.
Okay. How did you describe it as the controversial sections?
These are the controversial sections. There we go.
Section 8.
So when this bill came out of the Senate Ag Committee, the agency had requested language that would have prohibited municipalities from assessing stormwater fees on the impervious surface of farms.
So currently, that current law says municipalities can do that?
Not in my opinion.
Okay.
So when you look at current law, you look at the municipal authority to regulate stormwater. And it's there. It says that a municipality can adopt bylaws to regulate stormwater management and control. But all municipal bylaw authority is also subject to the limitations on municipal bylaws. And one of those limitations is in 24 VSA 4413, which says a municipal bylaw shall not regulate required agricultural practices. So a municipal bylaw shouldn't regulate required agricultural practices. In addition, underneath the required agricultural practices are there to control non-point sources of agricultural waste to waters. So what do they regulate? They regulate stormwater from a farm. So a municipality should not be able, because municipalities can regulate stormwater, but they can't regulate RAPs, RAPs are requirements for ag stormwater. Municipalities can't regulate ag stormwater. So it's just a logic chain there. Well, they are regulated. They are assessing significant fees on the impervious surface of farms. And the municipalities that are doing this are the municipalities that are called the MS4 towns, the municipal separate stormwater system towns. And generally, MS4 towns are those that have a certain higher density of population than others. And the Federal Clean Water Act requires those higher population towns to implement additional stormwater management practices like street sweeping or clearing out a catch basin or doing additional road practices. And the in Vermont, the MS4 towns were mandated to also adopt stormwater flow control because every one of the towns that's an MS4 town has an impaired stormwater in it, stormwater impaired water in it. So that's how the state got around managing the stormwater impaired waters by telling the municipalities to manage them through the MS4 permit. So the municipalities are saying, hey, we're a utility and we should be able to assess fees on anyone who's contributing to our utility. So the runoff of water is contributing allegedly from farms is contributing to the MS4 and they should be able to assess fees. And in fact, there is authority in Title 24 that says municipalities can create sewer districts, and the term sewage includes stormwater, and sewer districts can assess rates and charges, et cetera. But remember, they're doing this under their MS4 authority. And MS4 is a NIPDES permit. And NIPDES permit rules say ag stormwater doesn't need a permit. So you've got the logic of municipalities can't be regulating RAPs because RAPs are stormwater requirements. You also have Title 10, 1264 that says A&R can't regulate stormwater runoff from agricultural practices. You have the NIPDES rules that say ag stormwater runoff and silvicultural runoff doesn't need a NIPDES permit. But you have these municipalities assessing these permit fees, these impervious surface fees on these farms. And Senate Finance got testimony that one farm's fee was $9,000 and another one's was $6,000. And so what is your intent? When construing statutes, the primary goal of a court is to give effect to the legislature's intent. And there's many ways for you to do that, but the primary one is the language that you use. And so what the agency had proposed was to include in Title 24 that authority for municipalities to regulate stormwater by bylaw to provide that municipality does not exceed A&R's authority to regulate stormwater and maintains the exceptions in 10 VSA 1264 D1, which is that exception for required ag practices, and would not charge an operating fee related to exempt practices. They also proposed not to have that Section 8 in the original language apply retrospectively. In other states where it has been found that municipalities improperly impose the stormwater fee, the courts have required them to repay everyone. And that can be really expensive. And so the committee said, yeah, municipalities, you can't do it into the future, but we're not going to make you repay. So That's where it was when it came out of the Senate Ag Committee. It was sent to Senate Natural Resources because the municipalities were arguing, we have authority to do this and we need this fee authority so everyone contributes equally. Because that was kind of like the mantra when the Clean Water Initiative was enacted in 2015, 2016, that we are all in, that everyone's in together and everyone's going to be contributing their fair share to the cleanup of the state's waters. And so the Senate Natural Resources Committee had requested that that the sections 8 and 9 as proposed by Senate Ag be removed. And then it went to Senate Finance, and Senate Finance said, well, it seems like the municipalities lack authority, but we're not really sure. So we're going to have a report from the Commissioner of Environmental Conservation after consultation with the Agency of Ag and Municipal Stormwater Utilities. And they're going to report back to you whether or not property subject to the RAP should be subject to regulation by municipal stormwater utilities. Recommendations whether property subject to the RAPs should be required to pay an assessment or fee. Recommendation whether property subject to the RAP should receive an offset of any stormwater assessment. And that offset language is there because a few years ago, AOT came in and said the same thing. They said, hey, your municipalities are charging us these stormwater fees, but we're already implementing something else. And we shouldn't have to pay those fees since we're already incurring costs to control stormwater runoff from state roads. So the compromise then was the offset. The Agency of Transportation is still paying a fee, but they get a 35% offset, basically a rebate on the fee that they pay. The Senate Ag Committee wasn't real interested in the rebate. They wanted it to just be an exemption. So you're going to get this report about whether and how to assess municipal stormwater fees on impervious surfaces of farms. But until that report comes back, Senate Finance said between the effective date of the act and July 1, 2024, the municipal stormwater utility shall not assess a fee rate or other assessment or any other authority on stormwater from or impervious surface on a property subject to the RAPs. This is controversial.
Can you stay right there for a sec, Mike? Just the section 9. I'm reading just the last 2 lines. Any other authority on stormwater from or impervious surface on a property. So stormwater from a property or impervious surface on a property.
Yeah.
Okay. So we're not, sorry to interrupt your train of thought, but I just wanted to jump in here because when we started out, we mentioned impervious surfaces. I'm not sure that it's clear in everybody's head, it's not in mine, what we're talking about when we say impervious surfaces in this context. So maybe we could cover that, but then it looks like it's not just impervious surfaces here.
It is supposed to be on impervious surfaces, and that's how most of the municipalities are assessing the fee. So what the utility is supposed to do is control stormwater runoff and flow in the waters that are stormwater impaired. And so how they do that is because you can't really assess flow with like a predictable way. It depends on how much it rains and how much it melts. So what they do is they use surrogates, and one of the surrogates that they use for charging your impact on waters is what's called the equivalent residential unit. It's a formula that basically calculates the fee you will pay based on the amount of impervious surface on a typical residential property. So what they do, what they've done for these farms is they've assessed the ERU, the equivalent residential unit, on the impervious surface on these farms. Now, what is an impervious surface? Where'd it go? Oh, hold on a second. So impervious surface means those man-made surfaces, including paved and unpaved roads, parking areas, roofs, driveways, and walkways from which precipitation runs off rather than infiltrates. So it's your roofs, it's your patios, it's your driveway, paved or unpaved, it's any road, paved or unpaved, from which water runs off. And so you can imagine that some larger farms have a lot of roofs and roads and storage equipment from which stormwater runs off.
Okay, and I'm wondering, when does a couple of ruts from a wagon going back and forth turn into a road, an unpaved road? But that's maybe not the most important question to answer here. So, John, did you have a question?
Just do accessory on-farm businesses fall under this too? Because they're considered part of the farm, like if you have a.
So they're just going to calculate what the impervious surface is for that farm. And on some farms, they're doing actual calculation. So it would include what's accessory on-farm business.
Okay, so that's impervious surface. Back.
Right, and so.
Representative Templeman?
Sorry, I had a question. So is the point here to prevent pollution to spread into waterways? These impervious surfaces don't have manure, they don't have urine, they don't have anything on them. They're not sheeting off pollutants.
In fact, they are prohibited from sheeting off pollutants. Under the RAPs, you have to control the stormwater from your production area so that it does not enter the waters of the state if it has pollutants in it. If it has any pollutant in it, any ag waste in it, it has to be filtered or funneled, I should say, to your manure pit. That's where it's supposed to go. And then you can manage it as agricultural stormwater. And agricultural stormwater is the application of nutrients according to site-specific conditions, which has generally been interpreted to mean under a nutrient management plan. Again, agricultural stormwater does not need a NPDES permit according to EPA itself. But it's being required to pay a fee under this NPDES permit, this MS4 permit, which is a NPDES permit, that these municipal stormwater utilities are implementing. So EPA got involved in this. But I don't know if EPA really wanted to get involved in this, but the municipalities called them and said, hey, we're your MS4 town. We're being threatened with not being able to assess some of our buildings with a stormwater fee. And EPA was such a artful attorney response. They didn't say, yes, you can, or no, you can't. They just sent this rule section that said MS4 permits can have conditions in them that states can adopt above and beyond the federal law. And I'm like, what? It's like basically they're saying that the MS4 permit had a condition in it that allowed the municipalities to assess these farms. But when you read the MS4 permit, it says that it applies to discharges from the MS4 system or discharges from developed land. And it specifically says developed land doesn't include farms. So And farms are not an MS4 system. So every way I turn on this question, I'm like, yeah, you can't do that. But the towns really want to do it because they make a pretty good revenue from it. Some of them don't have that many farms and are really just more concerned about general implementation of the MS4. Some of them have budgeted for this money already and don't want to lose this money, $70,000 to $100,000 in some cases. And so that's a big deal to these stormwater utilities. But it's also a big deal to the farms that are being assessed. So that's where you are, instead of just like an outright,
Graham's got a question.
I just have a statement kind of was, you know, there's a lot of state roads and town roads where the stormwater drain go right into a brook or a river. You don't know what's on those roads.
so if it's a state road, they're supposed to, the AOT implements their own general permit for stormwater from state roads. And for municipal roads, there's the municipal road stormwater permit, which all towns are supposed to comply with. And you most likely see that over the past 5 to 10 years with the gravel ditches that have been put in many, many towns, like the heavy riprap.
Armored.
Yeah. That's there for multiple purposes, to slow flow, to collect sediment, to prevent as much of the pollutant collected from stormwater from actually going into the larger water.
We could discuss that all day long, but I won't go there.
Representative O'Brien?
Follow up on that, how does it work with, if these MS4 towns are municipalities and utilities, right? That they're policing themselves to some extent, because if town garages, schools in that town have stormwater runoff, how does that work? Do they have to get their own?
That's a great question. I know for federal buildings, the feds have said that the feds are going to be subject to these fees. Because in the past, they said, no, we're not. But now they've said, yes. I don't know how they're being assessed on. I know they're being assessed on schools, but I don't know if they're being assessed on, say, like the Public Works yard. I don't know.
So the Senate left this alone. They didn't mess with it. They are still allowing these municipalities to collect money from farms.
Not between the effective date of this act and July 1, 2024. That authority is suspended until the report in the Section 8 as passed the Senate comes back and you have an opportunity to legislate based on the recommendations in that report.
What does that mean?
It means the utilities.
For a year, nothing happened.
For a year, nothing, they don't get to collect. And then there's a process to develop recommendations. And if you want to act on those recommendations, you can. There's no directive that the General Assembly do anything because you can't really bind yourself that way. You'll be informed with recommendations from the report and you'll have opportunity to act before the rate suspension expires.
Okay.
In the meantime, though, the municipalities will not have collected the fees for the next fiscal year, for between July and June.
That's correct.
And you threw out a couple of numbers there, I guess, for a town or some sample town. Do we know how long those municipalities have been collecting?
It depends on the municipality. South Burlington has had a utility since like mid aughts, like 2005, 2006. Some of them have just implemented their assessment authority over the past couple of years. So it really depends on the town.
So I'm just going to mention the committee here who may be feeling, trying to absorb all of this, that somebody in the committee will have to report this bill, and that person will need to have a pretty good handle on what's going on here. So don't be shy about asking questions if you're not entirely clear on what current statute is, what Mike's interpretation of current statute is, what the bill says, what the original draft said. Couple of different things here. I have a handle on, John.
Is this going to House E&E because of this?
That's a good question. I don't know.
It went to Senate Finance, but it is an open question because it doesn't affect the revenues of the state.
But it also went to Senate Natural.
It went to Senate Natural as kind of a informal look.
Okay. Okay. Other questions?
You may want to talk to A&R. I think they were going to talk to EPA about this. I don't want to characterize A&R's position, but you've heard people tossing, you may hear people tossing around the phrase de-delegation. And so under the Federal Clean Water Act, states can be delegated to issue direct discharge permits, NIPDES permits. And if they fail to meet certain requirements, then EPA can de-delegate them. If EPA de-delegates a state, EPA has to assume all the permitting requirements. And so basically, if somebody says EPA has threatened to de-delegate us, they're saying EPA has threatened to adopt permitting for 90 plus wastewater treatment facilities, 500 plus farms, 20 MS4s, who knows how many multi-sector general permits, and who knows how many direct discharge permits. I don't think that's a reality because the closest EPA office is in Concord, New Hampshire. And Administrator Michael Regan has already said EPA needs more money to do what it's currently charged with doing in pretty much every EPA region where it is doing business. So I think if somebody says de-delegation, I don't think that's a realistic threat.
So somebody might make that somebody who's concerned about what might make that suggestion.
Concerned about the municipalities not being able to assess these charges.
Okay. Did you have anything else, Mike, that you wanted to mention?
No, that's the end of the bill.
Okay. And how many towns are there, those MS4 towns?
12 right now, 12 to 14.
And they're all designated that way because of their population density?
No,
Nothing to do with population density?
it did at first, but then the state needed a way to figure out how to meet the stormwater impaired waters TMDL. And so what they did is they required every town that had impaired stormwater, water impaired because of stormwater, to implement the MS4. So it's Burlington, Colchester, Essex, Junction, Milton, Shelburne, South Burlington, Williston, and Winooski, and the University of Vermont, and the airport. So those are technically municipalities underneath the MS4 rules because of the number of people that are passing through or using those facilities. And then there's the designated small MS4s, which include St. Albans Town, Rutland, Rutland Town. So when you look for a common theme among all of them, it's not population density, it's they have a stormwater impaired water in their municipality.
And what's the difference between the small and the not small?
It's really the population required towns and then the designated towns.
Looks like they're all small, right?
Well,
Up above.
yes, but some of them are small because they came in because of population density. Some of them came in because they're designated. There's something called residual designation authority. It gives EPA and or the secretary of the delegated state agency the ability to say, I don't care how big you are or what you're doing or whether or not you need a permit. We're going to designate you as contributing to a water quality issue, an impairment of the water, and we're going to require you to do something. So that's what designation means. It's kind of the catch-all. If you're contributing to the impairment of the water and you don't actually fit cleanly within some of the other permitting provisions.
John?
So is it DEC then that has jurisdiction or?
Over the MS4 towns, yes. With EPA is something, depending on the program, called either oversight or override authority. I call it the overlord authority, where they can say a state isn't complying with the minimum requirements, and they can use their leverage and their weight to get a state to do something that the state may not want to do.
So we're right back to that tension between AFM and DEC.
Yep. DEC on this one is kind of like, we don't really know. And so that's why they're supposedly working with US EPA right now on a proposed resolution. But I haven't heard anything about that for the past couple of weeks.
We'll have the agency of ag coming in tomorrow, not tomorrow, sometime later this week to tell us whatever they want to tell us about the bill, and we can hear more from their point of view.
Steve Collier, right?
Yeah. Yeah. All right, good. Well, thanks, Mike.
Far more complicated than Brian made it out to be.
Yeah. We hinted a little bit, but. All right, guess we're done. I've shut it down. We,